It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Saqib Bhatti, Labour MP Stella Creasy, writer and broadcaster Steve Richards, Daily Telegraph Associate Editor Camilla Tominey. Today, can the government stop migrants like these coming to the UK?
People are coming to the United Kingdom illegally, being smuggled, having their lives put at risk with these awful, perilous journeys.
She's closing off pretty much every door that people might use in order to flee persecution and rebuild their life safely.
Is the government about to take control of Liverpool City Council? Does the Prime Minister think greed led to vaccine success?
Boris Johnson is of course in favour of free markets, but greed is bad.
And Boris Johnson will be facing Keir Starmer at PMQs. That's live at noon. Let's start with this story, headlined in the BBC News, showing our viewers greed and capitalism helped UK's vaccine success, says Prime Minister. He was talking to the 1922 Committee of Conservative MPs last night. The Prime Minister's full remarks, which first appeared in the Sun newspaper, were reported to be: the reason we have the vaccine success is because of capitalism, because of greed, my friends. Before telling MPs reportedly, actually, I regret saying it, and telling them to forget I said that. Oops. Saqib, were you on that call of the 1922 group of Tory MPs?
Hi, Jo. I was. And, I took that comment in the jestful way that it was intended. Actually, what the Prime Minister was quite rightly pointing out was that through our system, our free market system, through capitalism, what we have is pharmaceutical companies who have delivered at a breakneck speed a fantastic vaccine which is being rolled out worldwide, due to the investment in innovation and R&D, it's really resulted in a vaccine that we can is world leading, really. So right. I think, look, let's not take the comments out of context. It was a bit jestful, and he was, in my view, I understood it that he was sort of making a comment on those people who really attack business for their desire to, of course, make a profit, but also do good things in society, like take risks and create jobs and innovate.
OK, yes, I understand clearly how you took those comments. Stella, is the Prime Minister right to say the profit motive, as Saqib was outlining, of private companies drove the successful development of the vaccine?
Well, it was poor taste on the day when we were all having a day of reflection, remembering the 126,000 people who've died from COVID in the last year in the UK and the thousands of families affected by it. But it's also just incorrect. I mean, actually, it's been the collaboration across the world to fast track the testing, for example, to pool in resources in terms of R&D, the government investment in R&D. So actually, it hasn't been a great example of free marketeerism. It's actually been an example of how, when people collaborate on a political problem, they can do that. I just wish we could collaborate on tackling some other vaccines that we need, for example, to help make sure that we can keep everybody safe and healthy. So, bad taste at best, but also just incorrect at worst.
Right. Well, Stella's right, isn't she, Camilla? I mean, even by his own admission, it was a mistake by Boris Johnson to use that form of words.
Well, I think Boris Johnson in noises off shock is probably the least surprising aspect of this story. He does have a tendency sometimes to open his mouth and say things and then later regret them. Was it a reflection perhaps on him having appointed a venture capitalist in Kate Bingham to chair that government task force? I interviewed Kate for the Telegraph magazine at the weekend, and she got a lot of brickbacks, not least from the left, who accused her of the crime of being married to a Tory MP. There was a hullabaloo over the fact that she had tried to bring in external PR consultants because they needed to try and find people to trial the vaccines on. But at the end of the day, because of her private sector business background, she took great risks. She, I think, levied $1 billion in advance against vaccines that they had no idea whether they would work or not. And maybe there are some that think that that punt was better taken by somebody who might have worked in the private sector as opposed to the civil service.
Right. Well, Steve, on that, can this whole discussion and the response to the pandemic really be boiled down to a battle between private and public?
No, it's much more nuanced and complicated than that. And I think those remarks, I think it's quite interesting that they leak out. I mean, it's by no means the first time in these private meetings with Tory MPs that some embarrassing phrase leaks out. But I also think it shows, and really when you think about it, people don't change much when they're in their 50s. There's part of Boris Johnson that is still that Daily Telegraph columnist. You could imagine him putting forward that idea for a column in the Telegraph. Oh yeah, greed is good. This is a triumph of capitalism. Let's write the column. But he's Prime Minister now, and these words, however taken out of context or whatever, become problematic because it's utterly simplistic, as Stella Creasy said, and wrong in many ways. So it made quite a good provocative column, although I disagree with it. But it's not the way a Prime Minister should be thinking on the day, on any day, but on the day where we were sort of reflecting on a year of lockdown. It shows that columnist mentality is still part of him. It's not wholly him. It can't be after being Prime Minister in this period, but it's there still.
All right. Well, as you say, it probably won't be the last time that something Boris Johnson says, supposedly in private, is leaked to the press, which we, of course, welcome. Here, let's move on to the Home Secretary's statement that is going to happen after Prime Minister's questions. Priti Patel's plans to shake up the asylum system, which she says is broken and wants to deter people doing this. I think we can show you pictures of people making that dangerous cross-channel crossing in small boats there, people smugglers. This is something that she wants to stop. She also, actually, for the first time, is going to use how someone enters the UK in terms of having an impact on how their claim for asylum is assessed. Saqib, should we take into account how someone arrived in the UK when we consider their asylum case?
Absolutely. I think, look, what the Home Secretary is setting out today is a new system, which, of course, will be open to consultation, but a new system which takes into account that actually the people who may need to gain asylum are often unable to do so because there are other people who've effectively jumped the queue because they're more able or they've been able to pay, people smugglers to make their way to the country. But I think also the plans today are really important because they take away the opportunity for people smugglers who are, of course, quite often part of organised criminal gangs. And, if those people who end up on our shores through these illegal means manage to survive the really treacherous journey, then they can also be subject to a lifetime of slavery trying to pay off the debt that they've already paid. So right. I think the Home Secretary has actually shown quite a lot of leadership to fix a system which is obviously not working, and to effectively do a end-to-end kind of revolutionary change. And I think it's actually very strong leadership.
Right. Do you accept, though, Stella, that there is an issue here that does have to be tackled and dealt with in terms of those people making that crossing in small boats?
Yes, absolutely. But anybody who thinks that this is going to stop the people smugglers from taking people and charging them horrific amounts of money just hasn't ever spoken to anybody who's a refugee or indeed worked in this field. What we need are proper, safe, legal routes, and to punish people for how they got here and how they try to claim asylum, rather than to look at why they're trying to claim asylum. Well, look, that breaches the Refugee Convention, and it also doesn't make any workable sense. I mean, my biggest concern with a lot of this, and as somebody who has a lot of casework to do with refugees, and let's be very clear, seeking asylum is not an illegal thing to do. But if you listen to the Home Secretary today, it's like she thinks it is. Fleeing persecution, trying to stay alive is not an illegal thing to do.
Right.
But only 20% of our cases at the moment are dealt with within 6 months. The problem here isn't people trying to claim asylum. The problem here, frankly, is politicians failing to invest in this system, failing to recognise what you need is proper, safe, legal routes, and recognising, I mean, yes, I think we need to reform the Refugee Convention, not least because it says at the moment that the only form of persecution you should be fleeing from is war. Yet we know in the modern era, many people are under distinct threat, for example, for their religious beliefs and flee persecution. Are we really going to punish them because they ran can, rather than recognising that they needed sanctuary.
Right. Well, I mean, isn't that the point, Sakiba, that if you're fleeing persecution, what is the legal route as such? You are fleeing a very difficult situation. You are arriving here. Shouldn't the focus be on the substance of the asylum claim, not how you got here?
Well, I think it's a very good question. And actually, just to pick up on something Stella said, actually, the Home Secretary also spoke about setting up fair and legal routes in country to help refugees that are legitimately needing asylum. Well, these will be obviously open to consultation. There have been obviously mechanisms in place before in terms of the rehoming of Syrian refugees. There was a scheme that aimed to put in 20,000 adults there, and it was in conjunction with the United Nations Commissioner on Refugees. And so certainly the reforms today that the Home Secretary is talking about is to have legal routes, so to stop people smugglers being able to take advantage. So I actually think there's a lot of good in the proposal here, and obviously we'll be looking forward to the announcement.
Well, before I open it up, Stella, do you want to respond?
Yeah, again, I mean, unless you've been to a refugee camp and seen the processing there, Sakib, I don't think you understand that that isn't a reasonable option. Also, there are millions of refugees in Europe. We take a tiny, tiny fraction of those people. There are children who have rights to be in this country. They have family here that we are ignoring in the camps in Greece at the moment and in Calais because we failed to deal with our own processing. Actually, what we need to do is get more bureaucrats involved in this rather than trying to overcomplicate the system and punishing people, particularly children, for being frightened of war and trying to flee, which is what this will do.
Right. I mean, Camilla, the point is, will it work? Will any of these suggestions actually work in terms of deterring people? We're just going to show our viewers the advert. New plan for immigration. Illegal migration to the UK will no longer be worth the risk. Written in big capital letters, just to emphasise it, as if that's going to make, I don't know, a big difference to people looking at it. Because apparently, if you arrive here illegally, you'll be stripped of benefits, you'll be regularly assessed for removal under an overhaul of the asylum system. And even if your asylum claim is successful, you won't necessarily have indefinite leave to remain. Will that stop people coming, Camilla?
Well, clearly that's an attempt, isn't it, to make Britain seem less enticing. But I think even Stella would agree that this has been a problem that successive governments have failed to resolve. There was some suggestion this morning that actually Priti Patel's one-stop shop isn't too dissimilar to the measures that David Blunkett tried to introduce when he was Home Secretary. This idea of trying to process at once in order to allocate according to need. And I think from the public's perspective, obviously lots has been said about immigration, not least in light of the Brexit vote. I think the public understands that there are people who have got the right to claim asylum, and they can understand completely that they end up in Britain. What they're concerned about is the lack of control over numbers, sometimes the seeming indiscriminate nature of who is being let in and who isn't, and equally people who are already in the UK needing things like housing, suffering as a result of more people coming in from outside. Now, I know that's a really difficult thing to resolve, both ethically and politically, but it's like every measure that comes in, I think most viewers will recognise a lot of the rhetoric that's been used by Priti Patel this morning and think it sounds familiar, but doesn't seem to have changed the state of things over the last 20 years. Having said that, we've obviously had much more highlighting on the notion of dinghies coming over from across the channel. And I think the public look at that and they think surely there must be some way to solve the issue of seeing children taking these perilous journeys. And I think that's Home Secretary's got a good intention there, hasn't she? Because she doesn't, at the end of the day, want to see people drowning trying to seek asylum in this country.
Stella, I will come back to you in a moment, but Steve, do you agree with that?
No, I think it's really interesting when you see a populist trying to implement legislation or devise legislation, and the tensions become profound. In fairness to her, she is a populist who is trying to legislate. Most populists don't dare do so. But in doing it, she's coming up against all the practical problems others have found with this. I remember a few years ago when Michael Howard was leader of the Conservative Party, he said they were going to kick out asylum seekers, the so-called illegal ones, and put them on an island. And Blair, then Prime Minister, who was wary of challenging populist policies at times, said, where is this island? And she can't, Priti Patel, say where all these people will be moved to. So she hopes it's a deterrent. But that implies these people aren't taking huge risks already in trying to get here. So I don't think the threat of this slogan, it's just not worth the risk, will deter people risking their lives already. So there are huge practical problems with the proposal she's putting forward today. It's much easier making an argument saying this is outrageous, kick them out and all the rest of it. Devise the legislation and the problems arise. And I suspect it is the case that what is needed is much more, as Stella Creasy said, more bureaucratic provision, amongst other things, to address a problem that is almost insoluble.
Camilla?
Well, I mean, bureaucracy is one thing, but I suppose there needs to be a kind of... Steve talks about populism. I don't know whether it's populism or common sensism, in the sense of something needs to be done to dissuade this illegal practice of people shipping people over at great cost to their own personal safety, in the hope of some kind of nirvana in the UK that doesn't even exist. Clearly, measures that have happened in the past haven't worked. That's the whole reason we're seeing these people take these perilous journeys across the channel. So what other options are there? The point is, what options are there?
Well, Steve, you were trying to come back in?
Well, just to say very quickly, Camilla said with great threat to their personal safety. I can think of no bigger deterrent than a threat to personal safety. And they are still coming. So I suspect the deterrent won't work, which leaves the issue of what do you do with them? And as I say, you know, the kind of thing of where there isn't an island, in inverted commas. So I think there are going to be huge practical problems when this legislation takes some kind of form.
All right, I'm going to just get a response from Saqib and Stella on this. I mean, is it a fantasy, this island, Saqib, in the first instance? And actually, promises of deporting people, it is notoriously difficult to do so, as previous governments have discovered.
Well, firstly, Jo, I think what I find surprising is this call for greater bureaucracy. I think, you know, what we will be seeing, and I'm convinced of this because of when I talk to my constituents, actually, is that they want less bureaucracy and they want a system that is fairer. You know, the country is very sympathetic to immigration, but when it is, you know, it's got to be through legal and fair routes. And I think no one can really deny, actually, that the system doesn't work as it currently stands. We need to address it. We need to take power away from these organised criminal gangs. We need to make it fairer for those people, like women and children, who need support, to make sure that there are legal routes for them to do this. And, you know, we have to intervene and make sure that a mechanism is in place to do that. And that's why I actually genuinely applaud the leadership of the Home Secretary on this.
All right, just briefly, so because we are going to return to this very issue after PMQs.
Yeah, let's not scapegoat refugees. It isn't refugees that are the reason why there's no housing in my local community. It's because we need to build more housing because more people are families living separate apart. It's easy to do that. The reality is we're talking about a tiny number of people. 40% of asylum claims are accepted on appeal. That's why we need better bureaucracy, because we're making bad decisions in the first place that leave people in limbo, hanging around, where we're not actually dealing with their claims. A safe passage process, dealing with the people in Calais, dealing with the people in Greece, in Europe, recognising why people are fleeing would be much more humane and, frankly, cheaper.
All right, we're going to talk about this, as I say, a little later on in the programme. Let's just show our viewers the front page of the Liverpool Echo. D-Day is the headline. City to learn its fate amid Tory takeover threat. That's because Robert Jenrick, the Community Secretary, is also in the Commons this afternoon, and we will hear whether commissioners are being sent in by the government to take over the City Council. Let's catch up with Andy Gill, the BBC's North West Tonight reporter covering this story. Remind us of the story, first of all, Andy.
Well, this came about because in December, the elected Labour mayor of Liverpool, Jo Anderson, and other people were arrested by Merseyside police as part of an investigation into property deals in Liverpool. Mr. Anderson was arrested on suspicion of conspiracy to commit bribery and witness intimidation. He was suspended, or rather, he stood aside from his job as mayor at the time. He's since said that he won't stand as the elected mayor again. He's also denied any wrongdoing. And last night we learned that his bail has been lifted, although he's still under investigation. He said in a statement to the Liverpool Echo today that he'll continue to cooperate with Merseyside police and that he'll still fight to clear his name.
Right.
One of the other people arrested was the City Council's head of regeneration, called Nick Kavanagh. He's now been dismissed by Liverpool Council. He, again, has denied any wrongdoing.
Andy, what's the city expecting to happen this afternoon?
Well, following those arrests, Robert Jenrick sent in a government inspector called Max Corler to look at the way the council operates on issues like planning, highways, regeneration and property management, and looking at whether the council was operating at best value. Mr. Corler's report has been with the local government secretary, Mr. Jenrick, for a few days now. There is a feeling that Mr. Jenrick may send in commissioners from Whitehall to run Liverpool Council directly. That would be a very unusual move, a very significant move, certainly in an authority the size and significance of Liverpool. It has happened in other authorities, but not in a city as big as this. Mr. Jenrick could take a slightly lesser approach. He could send in Whitehall officials to work with local officials, or he could take no action at all. But some people think that he might send in commissioners, which would leave Liverpool effectively directly run from Whitehall.
Andy, thank you very much for all of that. Steve, that would be a massive moment, wouldn't it, if Robert Jenrick does send in the commissioners to take over a city like Liverpool. As we heard there, it has happened with smaller authorities, but not like this.
Yeah, it would be a big moment, but in a way it reflects the odd kind of ambiguous relationship between central government and local government that we've got in this country. Local authorities are partly accountable to central government. Central government partly funds local services. And so we don't have the kind of robust, wholly separate tiers of government that some other European countries do. So there is a kind, although it will be a dramatic moment, you know, an elected council taken over by central government, there is a kind of, the way we do things, it's not completely bonkers. There is a sort of logic to it, and presumably it will be very temporary, but I don't know that. We'll hear this afternoon.
Right, as you say, we don't know how long that would actually be for. Stella, Labour's position on this?
None of us know what's in that report. Sure. There's clearly some very serious allegations. There's clearly police involvement. Until we see that report, nobody can comment on it, because I'm not going to speculate. It's clearly a very serious matter. At the moment, my main concern is obviously for the people of Liverpool, who I think are understandably very shocked by what's going on and very concerned about what it might mean for their city. But we have to see what the Secretary of State says later.
All right, as I say, that statement will be happening later this afternoon with Robert Jenrick. We're going to talk about something completely different, in fact, the issue of Brexit, because we're joined now by James Johnson, who is a former Downing Street pollster for Theresa May. James, you've written recently about the focus groups you've been holding and found that there is one subject people don't want to talk about, and that's Brexit. Why not?
Quite often when I talk about issues in focus groups, people are very keen to volunteer their opinions. On Brexit, it's really hard to get anything out of anybody. People sort of say it's done, they say let's move on, and there's a real sort of wall of apathy that you come up against. A lot of that is because the reason people voted so decisively for the Conservatives in 2019 on Brexit was because actually they were bored of it. They wanted it to go away, they wanted to move on from the issue. So we see a bit of that feeding through. We also see a lot of frustration and, quite frankly, disbelief that anybody could be talking about Brexit during a pandemic. So although clearly Brexit isn't going away in terms of trade deals, in terms of, indeed, frustrations over the vaccine, we do see it receding as an issue from politics. And that's particularly important because, obviously, one of the reasons the Conservatives vote won so big in 2019 was because of Brexit and also Corbyn. Those two things are now off the table. That might make it a little bit harder for Conservatives in those red wall constituencies.
Right, and we'll talk about that a little bit more detail in just a moment. But yes, you say that the issue has receded in terms of its salience for many voters. But what about their opinions on it when they do discuss it? Are they still sort of firmly held, or their views of whether it's been a success or not?
There is certainly a bit of that. You know, when you do go in, the divides are still there in that Leave voters more likely to think it's going well. Indeed, they're more likely to think the government in general is doing well at the moment, and the opposite is the case with Remain voters. But as I say, that really doesn't go too far in deciding how they'd vote. And in a poll that we did at the end of last year in the Red Wall, we found that the main hesitations among swing voters for voting Labour actually tended to be focused around things like the economy, whether Labour was too left-wing, and immigration. Brexit was a very small issue in that sort of constellation of hesitations that people had.
OK. Stella, what's your reaction to that?
I'm not surprised. I think we've all had fatigue. And obviously, understandably, we've been living through a pandemic for the last year. And if that isn't on people's minds, given the human, social and economic cost of it, I would be very surprised. I do think people are talking about Brexit, though, but they're not talking about Brexit as a concept. They're talking about the outcomes of it. I've got a lot of local businesses coming to me horrified by the paperwork. They're trying to keep their heads above water, having lost a year's worth of trade, and now looking at whether they can trade with Europe and just horrified by how complex it is and how difficult it all seems. So I do think people are talking about it, but they're not talking about Brexit as a concept. They're talking about Brexit as a practical reality and what it means for them.
Right.
What that will mean for the polls, who knows? Because I think, understandably, right now people are very focused on the immediate and, you know, what happens next week when maybe we start getting back to being together. But I don't think it goes away. I just think it evolves in terms of the impact on people's lives.
Right. I was thinking, what about your constituents? Are they talking to you about it, or has it gone away as an issue?
Well, of course, they speak about Brexit and, you know, how it's playing out in terms of the trade deal with the European Union. But also, you know, when I speak to constituents, they're looking at the vaccine rollout. They're looking at some of the noise coming out of Europe at the moment in terms of the AstraZeneca vaccine. And I think people are certainly more relieved that we're not part of the European, you know, medical agency and being stuck in their kind of mechanism as well. So it's a very complex picture. But I always say, look, campaigns are won on local issues. And, you know, a key issue here at the moment is that the Labour PCC wants to close the local police station. And that's certainly something that will be playing its part at the polls in May.
Right.
So,
Well, let's not talk about the elections in May. Let's just stick to the issue we're discussing.
I was just going to say the one on local issues, and I think James wrote in his article actually about how you know, voters want to know how parties will reward them in the future, not what they've done in the past. And I think that's right, and they will look at what's going on in terms of the focus on the north, the you know, Treasury moving up there, and the focus on levelling up, which are all really key issues.
Yeah, but that's an interesting point, though, isn't it, Saki? Following on from what James said, I mean, to some extent, you and your colleagues, many of them, were elected on that slogan, "Get Brexit Done." Without that there, do you think you'll struggle to hold on?
No, I think the key message actually was about delivery, and you know, when you see the rollout of the vaccine programme, the delivery of getting Brexit done, but also levelling up and the investment on infrastructure and all the other things that we're going to be focused on in terms of building back better, you know, which is often spoken about. These are the things I think that will play out quite significantly.
But Steve, I mean, all of you, I think, on the panel today will have been on endless Brexit programmes here on Politics Live and others. And you only have to think back. Stella's right, of course, we've had a pandemic, and that is at the forefront of everyone's mind. But when you think about the difference in opinion, when you think about the battles that were fought between Leave and Remain, it is to some extent surprising, isn't it, Steve, to hear a pollster like James say, actually, you know, people have moved on to some extent. It's no longer as big an issue as it once was. And yet there are still big issues to discuss around Brexit.
Huge issues. I mean, I think it's depressing, but not surprising. There's a kind of tendency in British politics to have a feverish focus on a policy like Brexit, and then to completely overlook all the consequences. It's happened many times on other issues as well. So, you know, all that excitement about all those votes in the Commons and things. Now the consequences are being played out near silence, but they are really serious. That trade deal unveiled on Christmas Eve was actually kicking all the issues into the long grass. There are immediate complications, but lots of things still to be resolved. So it is ongoing. It touches many people's lives, but because people are picking up that voters aren't bothered at the moment and all the rest of it, they get overlooked. It's happened many times before, you know, council house sales, huge issue. Margaret Thatcher, when she did it, cups of tea with new owners of old, and then the consequence, which was what do you do with affordable rented accommodation, completely ignored. This is bigger, really, because Brexit was so dominant for all of us and now is absolutely with us with all kinds of consequences, and no one's paying attention. It's weird and dangerous, I think.
Right. I mean, what's your reaction, James? Because you hinted at the beginning of the interview about perhaps what it might mean electorally for the Conservatives. I raised that with Saki. What do you think it will do now? There won't be that slogan, "Get Brexit Done."
Well, I think that the Conservatives will say, you know, that Get Brexit Done allows them to say, well, look, we've delivered this, we've delivered the vaccine rollout, we're delivering changes in the North and the Midlands. I'm not sure that will really cut it, though. The key barometer, I think, that the Conservatives will be judged on at the next election, particularly in these red wall seats, will be their values, will be, do they stand up for people like me? A lot of these voters who went over to the Conservatives for the first time did it quite reluctantly. They hadn't voted Conservative before. Their parents and grandparents always voted Labour. That will be the key question. We saw that waver a little bit last year with Dominic Cummings' trip to Barnard Castle. We saw sort of people start to question that in focus groups. People now feeling a little bit more positive again with the vaccine rollout. But that's going to be the key question. Can the Conservatives demonstrate over the next few months and years whether they actually really are on these voter sides on things like crime, on things like the economy, on things like immigration?
James, thank you very much. Camilla, do you think it'll be tougher, after 2019 when they had that slogan, "Get Brexit done," and lots of seats were won on that basis?
Well, I think "we got Brexit done" is not as effective as "get Brexit done," and equally they don't have the threat of Jeremy Corbyn. Having said that, I suppose the Conservatives will be taking comfort from the fact that there has been criticism within his own party, and indeed some of the left-wing press, of Sir Keir Starmer not having quite made his mark and people questioning what he stands for. I suppose there's a greater degree of clarity over what Johnson stands for comparatively, at least when it comes to Brexit. Having said that, I think the people are silent on the issue on both sides. That there has been an effect of the vaccine rollout and the EU's response. I think Brexiteers have looked at Ursula von der Leyen and felt relieved, and Remainers have been silenced by the behaviour because it's been quite shaming for Brussels and that whole bloc.
Steve?
I kind of think that some of the phrases that we mentioned in this discussion, which will be relevant at the next election, levelling up, dealing with the people who were left behind, these phrases that the government now uses, should be an opportunity for the Labour leadership because they imply agency, the state getting involved to level up. They're not just saying the government, free markets. Now, this should be a shift to the left in terms of the battle of ideas, which could benefit a Labour leadership, but they've got to show an agility and an ability to turn that to their advantage. There's a danger that if they don't do that, people would just say, oh, well, Boris Johnson has cleverly moved onto Labour's terrain, kept all those red wall seats potentially, and Labour lose again for the fifth successive time. So I think there is an opportunity in that terrain. But to go back to Brexit, I suspect it will still be around. For example, the whole fishing thing has to be renegotiated, and that will be happening in the build-up, I suspect, to the next election. Now, maybe the Tories will try and play the Brexit card again, but so Labour can't ignore it. I don't think they can carry on pretending it doesn't exist.
Right, and is it going to be a case then, Camilla, of how do you actually measure whether Brexit's been a success or not?
Maybe the government accounting on the COVID effect, muddying those waters. There was this sense in the run-up to securing that deal that Johnson felt he could be more emboldened to go for no deal because he thought that the economic fallout from that might be masked by whatever happened with the pandemic. And I think there's an argument for that. I think it's going to be quite hard to quantify any damage done in the melee of a global economic slowdown because of everything that's happened. So politically, that does give them a degree of protection against Brexit. But then it has to be remembered that the majority voted for Brexit and the majority voted for Boris Johnson's very Brexit-forward government.
Stella, Keir Starmer is reported to have said to people, look, don't talk about Brexit. The Labour Party should just move on. Perhaps that was a good strategy.
Well, but we've been talking about the impact of failure. I mean, the reality is Brexit isn't done. We're just at the start of the foothills of Brexit and all the nitty-gritty that goes with trying to organise new trade deals. And absolutely, we all look at the crisis in Europe around the vaccine. I wish we were in there fighting with people to talk about what could be done, because it's going to hurt us all if the vaccine rollout is slowed out across Europe. You know, the same people trumpeting how great it is that we're not part of the European Union when it comes to vaccine are also people complaining about the fact that people can't travel abroad and that we may see new variants of the virus coming from countries like France or Italy because of the slow pace of their vaccine rollout. Nobody ever said Europe was perfect, but we are in a situation now where the messy reality of walking away from that trading partnership and from walking away from those mechanisms of collaboration is going to start to tell. I think most people in most communities are desperately worried about their future. We've seen a massive rise in unemployment. We've seen a lot of people now dependent on universal credit or they're furloughed. And actually what the polls are telling us is that the public want to see investment in public services. So when I see Rishi Sunak going back to austerity, which is one of the things that left us in such a precarious position in the first place to be able to cope with the pandemic, I really worry. And I think a lot of people in seats across the country will see their public services being cut in the next couple of years and wonder what on earth has happened and how we're going backwards rather than forwards, the country coming out of this pandemic.
Saqib?
Well, look, it's not a surprise that Keir Starmer doesn't want to talk about Brexit, considering he spent years wanting to be in it. And I saw, of course, the Shadow Secretary for Scotland, I think Ian Murray, is attending the rejoin conference. So they definitely don't want to focus on that. But actually, I also challenge what Stella just said about Rishi and austerity. The truth of the matter is he's taken steps throughout the last 12 to 14 months to shore up the economy. I think that will be recognised. But also it is about the future and the commitment to free ports, the commitment to gigabit broadband, to investment in rail and bus. These are things that impact people in their daily lives, and these will be the local issues that they will take to the polls, I suspect.
Stella?
And giving nurses a pay cut isn't. I mean, people recognise how hard our NHS staff have worked over the last year, but the only person who's got a pay rise under Boris Johnson has been Dominic Cummings. That isn't the priorities of the British public, who've seen our NHS be tested as never before and recognise that we need to invest in the people in it to show them that we appreciate it and make sure it's there for us. God forbid this happen again.
James, I'm going to get a final word from you if you're still there listening to the discussion. Steve brought up the issue of particular stories around Brexit, whether it be fishing, whether it be on trade, and of course we're about to go on and talk a little bit about the vaccine. Do you think voters actually think about the individual stories, or do they see it still in that sort of concept of a catch-all phrase, Brexit?
Yeah, I think those things certainly could cut through if they sort of got mileage. I think if the vaccine war, for example, really genuinely did endanger British supply, then certainly in the next couple of months we might see that being an election issue. But I think in the long term, this is something that actually it's a bit of a reversion to mean, this sort of disinterest, because people didn't really name the EU, the European Union, as much of a priority even long before the referendum happened. So I don't see this plaguing our politics forever. It's the values that underpinned Brexit that will underpin our politics, and that's where the opportunity for Labour and the Conservatives lies.
Oh, James, thank you very much for joining us. We can welcome Laura Kuenssberg, the BBC's political editor. Just picking up on some of that and the discussion around Brexit and what it will mean in the coming years. And obviously the pandemic has been a massive feature of all our lives. I think some people may have thought there would have been a day of reckoning on Brexit at one point, whether you were on leave or remain. Do you think that will ever happen?
I think what we've seen really, and the pandemic has sort of blasted all the coverage of everything else quite understandably out of the water. But I think what we are seeing, and what we will continue to see, and actually what I've always thought we would see really, is issues flaring up every time and again on individual, whether it's sectors of the economy or questions around foreign travel, or indeed questions around the vaccine that are in part, perhaps influenced by the UK's decision to leave the EU, but not necessarily overtly about that. And I think, some of this polling that's out today, which is interesting, but if during the election, having been on the road and talking to lots of members of the public, Boris Johnson won an election in part on the basis that lots of the public wanted the debate about Brexit to be over. So I don't think we should really be surprised now if people are saying, why do politicians still want to talk about it? Because it was already the case even when we went into the general election. Now, that's not everybody, and lots of people wanted it not to happen. But there was a huge chunk of the public who looked at all the endless debates about it in Parliament and thought, why are they going on about it? We voted on this in 2016. And I think the concept of a sort of a day of reckoning, well, I don't quite know what that would look like. To many of the public, it feels like an awful long time ago now. Right,
well, let's stick to the here and now. We have a little bit of breaking news because we're going to talk about the summit tomorrow, or certainly part of the summit, which will look at a potential ban on vaccine exports by the EU. But the BBC's Europe editor, Katja Adler, has tweeted this. Breaking: Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, has unexpectedly announced cancellation of Easter 5-day shutdown made public yesterday. She said that decision had been a mistake. That's rather bizarre.
It's very, very, very unusual. I mean, something like this. There has been a lot of tension in Germany over lockdown, not just among the public, but also in between the Länder. So Germany, remember, has a federal system, very different government to ours. So there's been tension between the central government and the federal governments, tension among lots of the public who don't like the notion of lockdown. But remember, Germany, like other cases in Europe, is in a third wave. Cases are rising. They're having significant problems with the management of the disease itself. But here, having announced it only yesterday, Angela Merkel has gone public and said, we're not going to do that. She's asked for forgiveness. But she said, I shouldn't have announced it because it couldn't happen. It wasn't deliverable. So goodness knows what the reaction will be. But remember that although her party, the CDU, has been having quite a lot of problems in Germany recently, she is a politician who has been sort of almost uniquely venerated.
Yes, she has.
And in part, sometimes because of her ability to be humble or to show humility, but this is very
But I mean,
unusual.
a volte-face like this over a very big decision in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, Steve, how do you view that? Is it a misstep? Can Angela Merkel, for the reasons Laura has said, because she is such a sort of solid, stable leader over such a long period of time, what will people make of it?
Well, it's pretty dramatic, but it's a bit like what we were discussing earlier with the decision we're going to hear this afternoon about this central government and Liverpool. It's about really, in the end, who makes these decisions. And as Laura says, in Germany, it's a federal system where the states have much more control than our local government system here. But clearly there's been a tension which she has decided is now so overwhelming that she can't go ahead with it. So it's an uncharacteristically sort of speedy shift of position from her, but one that she clearly thought was necessary because what she had announced yesterday was meeting with resistance from these states which have considerable power.
We're just going to go into the chamber to show everybody there preparing for Prime Minister's questions and a busy afternoon of statements from the Home Secretary and what Steve was just talking about, the Communities Secretary decision, Robert Jenrick, over what will happen with Liverpool City Council. Let's return to the EU, this summit tomorrow, and also, interestingly, at the press conference, the Downing Street briefing from the Prime Minister yesterday, where he said when it came to the issue of vaccine exports and a potential ban, this ongoing row, he was hearing encouraging noises. So can this be averted?
I think it's definitely the government's hope that something dramatic and draconian like an export ban will not come to pass. That's why Boris Johnson has spent quite a lot of the last few days on the phone to European leaders. And there certainly have been discussions between officials on both sides of the Channel about the kinds of arrangements that could be put in place to help mitigate things on the continent a bit, without the UK having to suddenly surrender or put the brakes on its own programme. But there is still a sense, I think, in Downing Street that they're really waiting to see what comes out of the summit tomorrow. Now, when the European leaders actually make a plan on what it is they are going to try to do. Because don't forget, there's also a lot of division in the EU about the right way forward. So the Commission has been very, very bombastic about this. Ursula von der Leyen's statements have been really quite spiky. Not everybody in the EU is happy with that at all. I was talking to one EU contact this week who was saying that they're sort of fed up for picking up for her mistakes. You know, there's a lot of frustration with the Commission. And don't forget, we heard also from the Irish Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, saying he thought an export ban would be retrograde. So I think the hope on this side of the Channel is that it won't come to anything as dramatic. But clearly there's an issue here, and the EU is so far behind, they're going to keep pushing very hard.
Well, they are very behind, and it's been very sluggish for all the problems around AstraZeneca as well, as they see it in parts of the EU. But Camilla, the government, I suppose, has been treading relatively carefully, but they are accused of not doing enough to share or export vaccines produced here.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it, for the government sort of accusing others of vaccine nationalism while perhaps standing accused of it themselves in this kind of protectionist approach to keep vaccines for the British first. Although, to be fair, we were quick off the mark, and that task force led by Kate Bingham insisted that we make the deals quickly and that we establish manufacturing bases within the UK to produce these vaccines. I think Laura's raised an interesting point there when it comes to this whole Brexit factor. Well, how many member states are going to be satisfied with the EU's response on this? I think there is a great deal of dissatisfaction across Europe, actually, as to how von der Leyen and others have managed this whole situation. And may they, in turn, see a backlash when it comes to the wash-up over in Europe of how the bloc has handled this crisis.
Stella?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I just think one of the frustrations about all of this is that we will still be damaged if the EU vaccine rollout is delayed, because it will give more time for virus variants to develop. It will make it harder for people to travel and to trade. So we do have an interest. And the saddest thing for me is that we're not in the room to be able to help those discussions and help people come to a sensible compromise on these things. And as a consequence, we will still miss out. We will still be affected. So the idea that being out of the European Union protects us from these problems just doesn't make any practical sense. I'd much rather we work it out. So I think it's frustrating that we have a Prime Minister who, it sounds like, he can do diplomacy in private but not in public. But actually, now more than ever, we need to be able to work with people, because vaccine nationalism benefits absolutely nobody.
Is that point being lost a little bit, Saqib? That idea that actually, we're not safe until everyone is safe. The Prime Minister mentioned it yesterday, but not being in the room makes it more difficult.
Well, of course, Jo, to answer your question, no, I don't think it's being lost. I mean, the Prime Minister mentioned it yesterday. I think that's exactly why he's taken this kind of statesman-like role to try and bring people back from the brink, certainly from the noises.
He's worried, that's why.
And, quite rightly, we all are. But of course, while we're not in the room, quite rightly, by the way, because otherwise the EU Commission would have taken control of our vaccine programme, which is why we've been so successful. So I don't think it's vaccine nationalism. It's just a matter of fact that we've been able to roll it out better. But he's actually also trying to bring
that's always been
people back from the
arguable,
brink.
Saqib, as you know. Steve?
Yeah, I mean, who knows what's going to happen? But if you look at it objectively, and I know objectivity is missing in all of this, it's in everybody's self-interest, given that everyone needs to be protected from this by everyone getting the vaccine, to come to some sort of arrangement. But there's a lot of mythology around. I mean, member states could do what they like with vaccines. They could have done what Britain did when, incidentally, we were still sort of in the EU.
Steve,
when we did nothing.
I do apologise. It's Prime Minister's questions.
Okay.
Thank you to all of you.
It's difficult for a generation, and I know that the thoughts of the whole House are with all those who have lost loved ones during the pandemic. I also want to pay tribute to every person in this country for playing their part, whether working on the front line, staying at home to prevent the spread of the virus, or working on vaccine development and supply. And it's that vaccination programme that has brought hope, allowing us to set out the cautious but irreversible roadmap out of lockdown. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Let's go to Stephen Farry. Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many independent countries, from Switzerland to New Zealand, have bilateral veterinary agreements with the European Union and face lower non-tariff barriers than the UK, despite our very high standards. With the Food and Drink Federation reporting a massive drop in UK food exports, over 90% in some areas, and furthermore, SPS checks constituting the main challenge for the Northern Ireland Protocol, surely the Prime Minister should be making it a priority to negotiate a bespoke UK-EU veterinary agreement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and that's exactly why we put in the temporary and technical measures that we have to allow free trade to continue across the whole of the UK. And it's very, very important for those who object to the measures that we have taken that the protocol should uphold the principle of east-west trade as well as north-south trade, and that's exactly what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Sussex, by the end of this week, we will have delivered 1 million COVID jabs. Will my right honourable friend join me in paying tribute to the local vaccine heroes, in particular Adam Doyle and his leadership in Helsham, Charlotte Lack in Uckfield and Dr. Susie Padgham in Crowborough? And will the Prime Minister agree with me that the UK's success is built on the confidence that people have in the fantastic vaccine technology? And should and when our constituents get contacted for a vaccination, they should definitely take up the first available appointment.
Well, I can certainly join her, my honourable friend, in paying tribute to Adam Doyle and Charlotte Luck and Dr. Susie Padgham for all their efforts, and she's completely right in what she says about the foundations of the UK's vaccine success. And I had my jab on Friday, Mr. Speaker. I know whether you've had yours, or you certainly have, but I know he's had his. I encourage everybody to get it.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, the Right Honourable Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start with joining the Prime Minister in his remarks about yesterday's day of reflection for the 126,000 people who lost their lives to COVID? That's a shocking number, and behind every one of those numbers is a grieving family. As soon as restrictions lift, there must be a full public inquiry, because that is the only way we can get to the bottom of the many mistakes that were made during the pandemic and find justice for those who've suffered so much. Mr. Speaker, why did the Prime Minister promise at the last election that he would, and I quote, not be cutting our armed services in any form?
Mr. Speaker, that was because what we were going to do was actually increase spending on our armed services by the biggest amount since the Cold War, £24 billion, modernising our armed forces, keeping with no redundancies, Mr. Speaker, keeping our army at 100,000 if you include the reserves. And I must say, I take it slightly amiss from the right honourable gentleman when he stood on a manifesto to elect a man who wanted to pull this country out of NATO, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, he's fighting the last war, but is he trying to pretend? Is he trying to pretend, hidden in that answer, that the army stands at over 100,000, the number the Prime Minister quoted there? Because it's absolutely clear from the Secretary of State for Defence's statement that I think he made here on Monday. He was absolutely clear. His words, "I have therefore taken the decision to reduce the size of the army to 72,500 by 2025. Only this Prime Minister could suggest that a reduction from 82,000 to 72,000 is somehow not a cut. But the Prime Minister didn't answer my question, which was why did he make that promise? He said, before the last election, Prime Minister, all very well looking up, we will not be cutting our armed services in any form. What did he do this week? He cut the British Army by 10,000, he cut the number of tanks, he cut the number of planes for our RAF, and he cut the number of ships for the Royal Navy. I say he, the Prime Minister didn't have the courage actually to come to the House himself to say what he was doing. So let me ask the Prime Minister a simple question. Going back to that promise before the election, did he ever intend to keep his promise to our armed forces?
No. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, not only did we keep our promise in the manifesto last time, we actually increased spending by 14% more than that manifesto commitment. And again, Mr. Speaker, I think it frankly satirical to be lectured about the size of the army, when the shadow Foreign Secretary herself only recently wrote that the entire British Army should be turned into a kind of peace corps, Mr. Speaker. And when, as I say, the leader of the opposition stood on a manifesto wanted to elect a leader who himself wanted to disband the armed services. This is a massive investment in our defences and in our future. And it's wonderful to hear the new spirit of jingo that seems to have enveloped some of the Labour benches. They don't like it Upham, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Let's try this for Upham, because the Prime Minister might want to avoid the promises he made, but I found an interview he gave during the general election campaign. Under the headline, here's the headline, "No troop cuts. Tories will maintain size of armed forces." It then goes on to quote the Prime Minister. Boris Johnson has promised that he will not make any new cuts to the armed forces. He also promised, might want to listen to this, Prime Minister, he also promised to maintain numbers at their current level, including the Army's 82,000. Now, I know the Prime Minister's got form for making up quotes, but can he tell us, does he think the newspapers have somehow misquoted him, or does he now remember making that promise?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, because there will be no redundancies in our armed forces. And I said to him, if you include reserves, we're even keeping the army at 100,000. But on top of that, Mr. Speaker, we're doing what is necessary to modernise our armed forces, taking them into the 21st century, building more frigates, Mr. Speaker, investing in cyber warfare, Mr. Speaker, doing all the difficult things that Labour shirked during their time in office, including, Mr. Speaker, modernising and upgrading our nuclear deterrent, which again, half the shadow front bench would like to remove, leaving Britain defenceless internationally.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I have every respect for our reservists, but the Prime Minister is just playing with the numbers. He knows very well that the numbers have been cut. The trouble is you just can't trust the Conservatives to protect our armed forces. Let's look. Mr. Speaker, let's look at their last manifestos. These are the manifestos that those opposites stood on. The 2015 manifesto.
Order. I'm struggling to hear the Leader of the Opposition, and I will hear the Leader of the Opposition, so please, I want the same respect to the Prime Minister as respect for the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The 2015 manifesto. We will maintain the size of the regular armed services. The 2017 manifesto. We will maintain the overall size of the armed forces. 2019, the Prime Minister. We will not be cutting our armed services in any form. But the truth is, since 2010, our armed forces have been cut by 45,000. And our army will now be cut to its lowest level in 300 years. Let me remind the Prime Minister and members opposite why this matters. Lord Richards, former Chief of Defence Staff, has warned that with an armed force of this size now, we almost certainly wouldn't be able to retake the Falklands or stop genocide. He says it's rubbish. That's Lord Richards, Prime Minister. After 10 years of Conservative government, is the Prime Minister not ashamed of that?
Mr. Speaker, this Conservative government is massively proud of the investment that we've made in our armed forces, which, as I say, is the biggest uplift since the Cold War. And he should look at what the NATO Secretary-General had to say about our investment, which is absolutely vital for the future success of the alliance and, indeed, for the security of many other countries around the world. A £24 billion investment in the future combat air system and use Army Special Operations Ranger Regiment, £1.3 billion to upgrade the Challenger main battle tanks, massive investment in the Typhoon squadrons, and so on. We're investing in the future, Mr. Speaker, and yes, of course, we've had to take some tough decisions, but that's because we believe in our defences and we believe that they should be more than merely symbolic. And it's the Labour Party, Mr. Speaker, who are consistently, historically, hilarious to be lectured about the Falklands, Mr. Speaker, consistently weak on protecting this country, and you heard it. It was most visible last week, Mr. Speaker, during the debate on the integrated review, when it was plain that the shadow front bench couldn't even agree to maintain Britain's nuclear deterrent. Absolutely true, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, what's weaker than making a promise to our armed forces just before the election, then breaking it and not being prepared to admit it, not having the courage to admit it? And there's a pattern here, Mr. Speaker. He promised the NHS that they would have, quote, whatever they need. Now nurses are getting a pay cut. He promised a tax guarantee. Now he's putting taxes up for families. He promised he wouldn't cut the armed forces. Now he's done just that. So if the Prime Minister is so proud of what he's doing, so determined to push ahead, why doesn't he at least have the courage to put this cut in the armed forces to a vote in this House?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of what we're doing to increase spending on the armed forces by the biggest amount since the Cold War. The only reason we can do that, Mr. Speaker, is because under this Conservative government we've been running a sound economy. And it's also because we believe in defence. We've been getting on with the job. He talks about nurses and investment in the NHS. I'm proud of the massive investment that we've made in the NHS. And actually we have 60,000 more nurses now in training, and we've increased their starting salary by 12.8%. We're getting on with the job, Mr. Speaker, of recruiting more police, 20,000 more police. I think we've done 7,000 already. Well, they're out on the streets, Mr. Speaker, at demonstrations shouting, "Kill the bill," Mr. Speaker. That's the difference. That's the difference between his party and my party. We're pro-vax, Mr. Speaker. We're low tax, and when it comes to defence, we've got your backs, Mr. Speaker.
Can I just say, I genuinely mean this. I do not believe any member of Parliament would support that kill the bill. I've got to be very careful of what we say. I say we are all united in this House in the support and the protection that the police do offer us, and nobody will shy away from that. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The question, Prime Minister, is why not put it, I didn't have the courage to put it to a vote. That question, of course, was avoided, Mr. Speaker, like all of the questions. And we all know why he won't put it to a vote. Let me quote his Conservative MP, Chair of the Defence Select Committee, because he recognises, and he has experience and respect across the House, he recognises that this review means dramatic cuts to our troop numbers, tanks, armoured fighting vehicles, and more than 100 RAF aircraft. And he goes on to say, your MP, Prime Minister, cuts that, if tested by a parliamentary vote, I do not believe would pass. Not me, his own MPs. Mr. Speaker, can I say this? Because I want to turn to another issue that affects thousands of jobs in many communities across the country. 5,000 jobs are at risk at Liberty Steel, with many more in the supply chain. The UK steel industry is under huge pressure, and the government's failure to prioritise British steel in infrastructure projects is costing millions of pounds in investment. So will the Prime Minister now commit to working with us and the trade unions to change this absurd situation, to put British steel first, and do whatever is necessary to protect those jobs?
Mr. Speaker, I'll just remind, I'm of course happy to cooperate in any way, but the steel output halved under the Labour government. I share very much the anxiety of families of steel workers who work in Liberty Steel, and that's why my honourable friend, the Business Secretary, has had, I think, 3 meetings just in the last few days with Liberty Steel to take the question forward, see what we can do. We are actively engaged. We're investing huge sums in modernising British Steel, British Steel plants, making them more environmentally friendly. But we have a massive opportunity, Mr. Speaker, because this government is engaged on a £640 billion infrastructure campaign. HS2, the great Dogger Bank wind farms, Hinkley, all the things that we're now building, the Beeching Railway reversals, all the things that we're doing across the country, they will call for millions and millions of tonnes of British steel. And now, Mr. Speaker, thanks to leaving the European Union, we have an opportunity to direct that procurement at British firms in the way that we would want to do. Whereas I know that the right honourable gentleman would like nothing more than to take this country back into the European Union and remove that opportunity for British steel and British steel workers.
Miller. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last night I spoke with young people in Aberconwy about their experiences of 12 months living with lockdowns. They were very articulate about the challenges they've overcome and about their concerns for their future, finding a job, moving to a new university. Does the Prime Minister have a message for Evie, Jonas, Saul and Lauren, who I spoke with, and other young people who are thinking about their future and a life after lockdown?
Yes, my message is just to thank them and to say for what they put up with, and to say I'm sorry about how difficult it has been for their generation. I don't think there can be any group of young people who have been put through much or have had to sacrifice so much in our lifetimes, and we owe it to them to repair their education and to get them into work as fast as we possibly can, and that's why we've set out the £2 billion Kickstart Fund and many other schemes which I hope will be useful to his constituents.
Let's go to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford. Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, my brilliant colleague, the member for Airdrie and Shotts, made his final speech to this Parliament. He is standing for the Scottish Parliament and is doing the right thing by stepping down as an MP. By doing the right thing, he will avoid a dual mandate and a separate by-election that would cost the public £175,000. Mr. Speaker, the Scottish Tory leader is also seeking a place in the Scottish Parliament, but is refusing to step down as an MP. So, as his boss, will the Prime Minister order the member for Moray to resign his seat, avoid a dual mandate, and save the taxpayer £175,000? Or are dual mandates one more Tory policy where they think greed is good?
Prime Minister.
I think my honourable friend, the member for Murray and Ross, is doing an excellent job of holding the Scottish National party to account for their manifold failings, not least on education, failing to deliver on crime, and failing, in my view, to deliver for the people of Scotland, so caught up as they are in their desire for independence and another referendum. And for separation. I'm amazed, actually, that he hasn't mentioned it so far, but perhaps he will now.
Let's go back to Ian Blackford. Ian.
Simply yet again a Prime Minister failing to answer a question, and that charge that greed is good in the Tory policies. Mr. Speaker, we know that Tory leaders in Scotland have a habit of dodging democracy. Baroness Davison is fleeing the House of Lords, and the current Tory leader is too feared to stand in a constituency. No wonder this morning's Daily Record declared that the Scottish Tories have exposed themselves as shameless, as nasty, and just plain daft. They are led by a man so devoid of imagination that when asked what he would do if he was Prime Minister for a day, he replied, "I would like to see tougher enforcement against gypsy travellers." Does the Prime Minister really have confidence in a Scottish Tory leader who doesn't even have the courage to put himself before the voters in a Scottish constituency?
Of course, Mr. Speaker, and the right honourable gentleman represents a party that's so devoid of imagination that it can't come up with any workable solutions to help the people of Scotland improve their education, improve the fight against crime, cut taxes in Scotland where they're the highest in the whole of the UK. They're so devoid of imagination, Mr. Speaker. They're the one track record. All they can talk about is a referendum to break up the United Kingdom. That's their song. I'm amazed, actually. It's twice he hasn't mentioned it. Maybe he's getting nervous of singing that particular song. How do you know? It's rather curious, Mr. Speaker. Well, he's not coming back, is he? But next week, let's see, or after Easter, let's see if he mentions it again.
Miriam Kate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend has already said, the steel industry is fundamental to our future in the UK, and we can't reach our net zero commitments or our infrastructure targets without steel. But Stocksbridge Speciality Steels in my constituency does have an uncertain future because of the funding challenges faced by Liberty Group. The Stocksbridge Works is a strategic asset of national importance. So what assurances can my right honourable friend give my constituents that the government will do what it takes to safeguard jobs and livelihoods and secure the future of steelmaking in the UK?
I thank my honourable friend, and she's a passionate and successful advocate for her constituents and for steelmaking in this country, in which this government passionately believes. And that's why, as I was saying to the right honourable gentleman, we're supporting the UK steel industry with more than 500 million of relief, but also with huge investments to make our steelmaking more greener and more competitive. And we will do everything we can, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we continue with British jobs for producing British steel with the infrastructure investments that I've mentioned and directing that procurement at British jobs in the way that we now can.
David.
The Prime Minister talks about restoring freedoms as we emerge from the lockdown. It is pushing a bill that will restrict one of our most fundamental freedoms, the right to peaceful protest and peaceful assembly. And tomorrow, he is asking for another blank cheque to restrict everyone's freedoms until September, even though we now know the vast bulk of the Coronavirus Act is not needed to tackle the pandemic. So will the Prime Minister, for once, match his actions to his words, drop these draconian laws and instead publish a roadmap to revive civil liberties and freedoms in our country?
I sympathise very much with his desire to see freedoms restored. And I want to do that as fast as we possibly can. That's why we've set out the cautious but we hope irreversible roadmap that we have, which I hope that he supports, and I hope the right honourable gentleman also supports, so you can never tell, Mr. Speaker. But what we also want to do is to make sure that we're able to deal with the very considerable backlog that we faced because of the pandemic. So making sure that we have powers still to accelerate court procedures with Zoom courts, to make sure that we allow volunteers to continue to help in the NHS, retired staff to come back to the colours, powers that are necessary in education. It is important to be able to continue with those special measures for the months ahead, and that's why we've set out the bill as we have.
Lucia. Mr. Speaker, my constituent Tracy Felsted is at the Court of Appeal today, along with 41 other sub-postmasters. She is seeking to clear her name in a grotesque miscarriage of justice, the Post Office Horizon scandal. The court has heard that the institutional imperative to back a flawed IT system and to convict sub-postmasters, destroying lives of decent men and women in a ruthless determination to protect the post office, come what may. Taxpayers will be picking up the bill for this multi-million-pound reckless wrongdoing. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that in order for justice to be truly done, that those responsible for this failure and its cover-up, they must be held to account? Does he agree that heads should roll?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we've certainly, I certainly understand my honourable friend's strong feelings on this issue, and her campaign is one I think that is shared by many members across this House, and that's why we launched the Post Office Horizon IT inquiry, which has made actually quite fast progress. And yes, we do want to learn the lessons. Yes, we do want to make sure that the right people are held to account for what happened, and that the Post Office never repeats a mistake like this.
Let's go to Alan Dollins. Alan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good afternoon. Subject to certain conditions being met, the Northern Ireland Act of 1998 allows for the Secretary of State of Northern Ireland to call a referendum on Irish reunification, and for Northern Ireland to leave the United Kingdom within 7 years of a previous referendum. These conditions for a referendum have all been more than met in Scotland since the independence referendum in 2014, 7 years ago. We are allegedly a union of equal nations. So why, as a Democrat, will the Prime Minister not agree to a Section 30 order enabling the democratic will of the people of Scotland to be measured? Is it because he's fearful of the likely outcome?
Mr. Speaker, I knew it wouldn't be long. There they are. The reason, Mr. Speaker, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, as senior members of his party said, it was a once-in-a-generation event in 2014. I think the point of view that is shared across the House, and quite rightly. But the other reason, which is absolutely plain to most people in this country, is that we're all trying to build back better, get out of a pandemic, and I think that is the priority for the British people. I think it's the priority for the whole country, and I think people are frankly amazed to hear the Scottish Nationalist Party still, in these circumstances, banging on about their constitutional obsessions.
Let's go to John Long.
Mr. Speaker, Scottish rugby legend Doddie Weir lives in my constituency and has been diagnosed with motor neuron disease. Doddie's foundation, the My Name's Doddie Foundation, is campaigning alongside the research community, patients, MND Scotland and the MND Association for the government to invest £50 million over 5 years to establish a virtual MND research institute. Now, I understand positive discussions have already taken place with the Health Secretary, but it's important to ensure other priorities such as this are not lost in the pandemic. Will the Prime Minister commit the government to supporting this initiative so we can work towards finding a cure to this devastating disease?
I thank my honourable friend very much for raising this important question and for championing research into motor neurone disease, and I thank him also for raising the excellent work of the My Name's Doddie Foundation. And we've spent £54 million in the last 5 years towards this cause, Mr. Speaker, and we're looking now at ways significantly to boost the research that we're supporting.
Let's go to Afzal Khan. Afzal.
Mr. Speaker, a year into this crisis and more than 126,000 lives have been lost. Behind this staggering figure are millions grieving their loved ones. In my family, we have lost an entire generation. I couldn't hold my mom's hand as she lay dying, and I recently lost both my father and mother-in-law within just days of one another. Grieving families like mine want and deserve to understand what happened, and if anything could have been done to prevent this tragedy. So will the Prime Minister today commit to launching a full public inquiry into the handling of the pandemic as soon as current restrictions are lifted?
Mr. Speaker, I want to say to the honourable gentleman that I know that the whole House shares my sympathies and my sorrow for your loss, for his loss. And we sympathise also with his entire family, Mr. Speaker. And I know that his experience is one, as he rightly says, that has been shared by far too many families up and down the country. And that is why we are, of course, committed, as soon as it's right to do so, as soon as it wouldn't be an irresponsible diversion of the energies of the key officials involved. We are, of course, committed to an inquiry, to learn the lessons, to make sure that something like this can never happen again.
Can I just try and push us through to get through the list? Andrew Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 3rd of May, Wembley is scheduled to host the finals of the FA Vase and FA Trophy, not from this season, but delayed a year from the last one. But that date means that no fans can go, even though a trip to Wembley to follow their team is like a holy grail, especially for the smaller clubs. The MPs for the clubs involved, that's the members for North West Durham, Jarrow, Castle Point and myself, have raised this with the FA. Will the Prime Minister join us in encouraging those scheduling the matches to do all they can to move the date so that fans can attend?
Yeah. I hope very much, Mr. Speaker, that the Football Association will have listened carefully to what my honourable friend has to say, and they do what they can. And I look forward to May the 17th, when spectators, according to the roadmap, may return.
Roddy Callum.
Much, Mr. Speaker. 17 months ago, Prime Minister, I stood in this place and asked you what you're going to do to get medical cannabis to children suffering from rare forms of epilepsy. And you said to me you recognise their desperate difficulties and that you would take it up personally with me. Their difficulties are still desperate, and you've not taken this up personally with me. In the interim, we've developed new medicines, distributed them around the country, given to people who need them free of charge. Why are we discriminating against these children? What are they? Are they worth less than the general public? And will the Prime Minister move to make medical cannabis available to children with epilepsy? And if you could please, Prime Minister, take this up with me personally, 5 minutes of your time today could go a long, long way.
Well, I'm very happy to do whatever we can to meet with the honourable gentleman and take the matter forward. But the Dutch government, I'm told, has confirmed they will allow the continued supply of Bedrocan oil against UK prescriptions until at least the summer until July, as he rightly says. And my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, is working to find a permanent solution. I have no doubt that he'll be very happy to meet with the honourable gentleman.
Let's go to Derek Thomas. Derek.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the past 12 months, I, like many others, would not want the job of Prime Minister, even for all the tea in China. However, the job does give opportunities to directly improve the lives of people who are very, very sick. March is Brain Tumour Awareness Month, and over 100,000 people have signed a brain tumour research petition calling for the government to match brain tumour research funding with other devastating cancers. And we know through COVID that properly funded research really can bring improved care, treatment and a cure. Will my friend, the Prime Minister, meet with me to receive the petition when it is safe to do so?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I thank him for what he's doing. I congratulate him for what he's doing to champion research into brain cancer, and I know from activists in my own constituency, where the Centre of Hope runs the Hillingdon Brain Tumour Injury Group, how vital it is, because too often people don't appreciate the number of people who are the victims of brain tumours, and we've put another 40 million into brain tumour research, and we are certainly going to put more, and I look forward to meeting my honourable friend.
Let's go to Emma Llewellyn-Burke. Emma.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My constituents, Ronald and Julia Sheriff's daughter, Danielle, currently lives in Gran Canaria. Last year, aged just 33, she suffered an aneurysm. Danielle remains deeply unwell, and her family are crowdfunding to bring her back home to live. They have been advised that when she does return home, she won't be eligible for the treatment that she needs on the NHS. Please, can the Prime Minister support the crowdfund for Danny and give his personal assurance that she will receive the care that she needs from our NHS?
I thank her very much for raising the case, and my deepest sympathies with Danielle and her family, and will make sure that the relevant health minister meets her to discuss the case as fast as possible.
Right, let's just go to Kelly Tolhurst. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 40 years on from my predecessor, Dame Peggy Fenner's opposition to the closure of Chatham Dockyard with the loss of thousands of jobs, I am now opposing the closure of what today is Chatham Docks, with the loss of over 1,000 skilled jobs. This regionally important asset, home to successful maritime and construction businesses, all growing in spite of COVID to make way for flats, short-term profit for the landowner at the expense of long-term economic and environmental benefit. Does my right honourable friend agree with me, local councillors and the Save Chatham Docks campaign, that coastal infrastructure plays a significant role in the growth of our local economies, creating jobs in clean maritime technology, contributing to our net zero ambition?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, one of the reasons why we put £24 billion into defence alone is that it drives 400,000 jobs around the country, including the building of new frigates and new ships of all kinds. And I hope very much that Chatham will benefit from the £100 million funding we put in the 24th of December to rejuvenate coastal towns. The matter she raises, the planning issue she raises, is a matter for the local council, but I do hope a solution can be found which gives the benefits that she describes for the local community.
We're going to leave Prime Minister's questions at this point. There are some more questions, and if anything develops, we will bring it straight to you. Let me welcome our guests for this part of the programme. Chris Philp, Home Office Minister for the Government, John Healey, the Shadow Defence Secretary for Labour, and Laura Kuenssberg, the BBC's political editor, is here. Well, it was a little bit like an old-fashioned clash at the dispatch box, away from COVID, talking about defence.
Yes, it was. It was sort of good old-fashioned Prime Minister's questions knockabout, and they both actually seem to be kind of enjoying it in a way that we haven't really seen, you know, that process of actually facing each other down. The charge from Sir Keir Starmer was a simple one, that the Prime Minister, with the government's defence plan this week, has broken what was a straightforward manifesto promise during the election, that they would not cut the armed forces. The government has promised to spend loads of money on all sorts of new whizzy bits of defence kit this week, but they are planning to reduce the numbers of forces. The Prime Minister tried to wriggle it out of it by suggesting there would be no redundancies.
Yes.
But, of course, that is not the same as what he said during the election, which was committing to keep the forces the same size.
All right, well, let's put that then to Chris Philp. During the last election campaign, it was very clear. Boris Johnson said, we will not be cutting our armed forces in any form. And yet you are now cutting the size of the army. Let's just show everybody here the article in the Sun newspaper, just to underline the point. Bojo vow on soldiers, no troop cuts. Very clear, categorical, I would say. So do you accept it's a broken promise?
Well, I think the Prime Minister made very clear in the House of Commons a few minutes ago that we're not cutting armed forces expenditure. In fact, we're increasing armed forces expenditure
what I asked you, Chris.
by £24 billion.
Just on that, people will just want a little bit of straightforward honesty. It may be the right decision, but just on that promise, that is now a broken pledge, because you are cutting the size of the army. The number of troops will be fewer. We've got the numbers. In fact, Ben Wallace, helpfully, the Defence Secretary, gave them to us. He said, I have therefore taken the decision to reduce the size of the army from today's current strength of 76,500 trained personnel to 72,500 by 2025. It's a broken pledge.
Well, the size of the arm, the number of soldiers will be reduced, as Ben Wallace just said in the quote that you gave, but the expenditure is being increased because what the review had to do was work out how best we can invest our money to keep our country safe. We're going to spend a lot more money, an extra £24 billion, the biggest increase in expenditure since the Cold War. And what the review concluded, I think rightly, is that the way we can spend that money best is by investing in the technology and the equipment that lets us project around the world. That is why we're increasing the number of destroyers and frigates up to 24. It's why the Typhoon is being overhauled. It's why we're going to be increasing the size of our nuclear capability, something on which the Labour front bench is hopelessly divided because some of their front bench don't think we should have a nuclear deterrent at all. So these investments are the right investments to make extra money that will make our country safer. And this is on top of those two aircraft carriers, enormous aircraft carriers that are now in service, which hugely increases the capability of our armed services.
Right, I'll come to the divided front bench in terms of the nuclear deterrent in just a moment. But John, first of all, do you accept that, all right, the army will be smaller, the number of troops, but with better equipment and better technology, that means we will be both safer and more effective? That's worthwhile.
No, I don't accept that. This is not just about the Prime Minister breaking an election promise to the public. It's about the first duty of any Prime Minister, which is to ensure that the country is safe. And it's certainly true, we must, and it's good to see this extra investment going into things like artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, electronic communications, some of the things that are badly needed. But in the end, when our servicemen and women are going to go to war with robots, that's still some way off. And robots and drones don't seize and hold ground from the enemy. They don't hold the peace, keep the peace and mend broken societies. They don't give COVID jabs. So this is about putting at risk the capacity of Britain properly to defend this country and our NATO allies, and our ability to act if unforeseen conflicts occur around the world, as they so often do. So it's a question of using this extra money, not to fill the black hole in the defence budget, but to make sure we manage this transition safely, securely, from the point of view of the country and our NATO allies.
Chris?
Well, I think that is exactly what we're doing. We're making sure that our armed forces are fit for the future, are able to defend our country in a dangerous and uncertain world. And clearly the sort of capability that we're investing in, the expanded nuclear deterrent on which Labour is hopelessly divided, the aircraft carriers that are already in service, the upgrades to the Typhoons, having 24, an increased number, 24 frigates and destroyers, will do all of those things. They will keep our country safer. The review I thought that Ben Wallace presented a few days ago was extremely thoughtful. It was extremely thorough. It did all the right things, and it will make sure our country is safe in the future. With this extra money, we're spending an extra £24 billion on our armed services, which, as I said before, is the biggest increase since the Cold War. We're doing the right thing by our armed services. We're keeping our country safe, while Labour is simply divided.
The problem with that is twofold, if I may say so. The Conservatives have formed over the last 11 years. Since 2010, they've cut the strength of the armed forces by 45,000. They've cut the defence budget by 8 billion. They've left gaps in the past in our capability to defend ourselves. So our maritime hunter planes detecting Russian subs were taken out of service. We relied on allies to do that job for us. And look, Chris, those aircraft carriers are great. We can send them out to the Indo-Pacific, but we have to have US planes to fly them off them, and we have to have Dutch ships to escort them, because we haven't got those in place for ourselves. The second really important problem is that I'm voicing concerns, and Keir Starmer today is voicing the concerns that are the same concerns as those in the House of Commons and in the military who know this best are also raising. These are decisions which could put at risk Britain's security and undermine further the foundation of our armed forces.
All right, I'm just going to get a response from Laura. But before I do, John, what size would the army be under a Labour government?
We've been ready to accept what the government has accepted and said 5 years ago in their defence review, that the minimum strength of the army needed to keep the country safe.
Yeah, but what would that be? I mean, you've said that this is wrong.
Was 82,000. Now, since 2015, as the Prime Minister confirmed when he launched the big integrated review in November, the state threats to the UK and NATO allies have been growing and diversifying. And in the face of growing threats, it seems perverse and a big risk to have fewer troops, fewer ships, fewer planes, which is what has been announced this week by the Defence Secretary.
Minister, if the plan is so good that it's worth breaking a manifesto pledge on, wouldn't it be the right thing to have a parliamentary vote on this? I mean, you know very well a lot of Tory backbenchers are unhappy about it, but if it's the right thing, shouldn't that be confirmed by Parliament?
Well, we vote on budgets and defence matters the whole time, but I don't accept what John Healey just said. You know, I just already pointed out we've got these two enormously capable aircraft carriers. We're increasing the number of frigates and destroyers to 24. It's perfectly normal when deploying overseas, for example, in the Indo-Pacific, to do so with allies. The alliances we have are a part of our strength. Our commitment to spending 2%, in fact, over 2% of GDP is unshakable. He mentioned the Conservative Party's record on defence. I mean, I think I stand proudly by our record on defence as a party of defence as well as law and order. It was only a couple of years ago that John Healey was proposing that we elect Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister, someone who didn't believe in the armed forces at all. And Labour's front bench, even today, are divided on the critical question of our nuclear deterrent, which is essential to keep our country safe in a dangerous and uncertain world.
Well, you've made that point 3 times, so, John, you better answer it. I presume he's referring, Chris, I should say, is referring to the Shadow Foreign Secretary Lisa Nandy, who has previously opposed Trident. Is Labour's commitment to the nuclear deterrent something that voters can depend on? And is the Shadow Cabinet united on it?
Voters can depend on it, and Labour's commitment to this minimum credible nuclear deterrent is non-negotiable. It's been our established Labour policy for 30 years. It was set out in our manifesto in 2019 and 2017 when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader, and that has been, in fact, that twin track, the commitment to Britain's deterrent and a commitment to Britain leading multilateral disarmament has not just been Labour's policy, it's been the government's policy under successive governments for nearly 30 years. And to Laura Kuenssberg's point there about a vote, of course, if the Prime Minister, as Keir Starmer challenged him today, has the courage of his convictions, has a belief in the plan to have rapid cuts to the strength of our forces, while the new systems and the new technologies which are needed will not come on stream for many years. If he's got the courage of his convictions in this, then he should put it to a Commons vote, and Labour will find a way of making sure that the Commons can properly express a view. Right. Because in the end, this isn't just about the politics in Parliament. This is about the defence of our country, as well as pledges that were given at the last election to the public.
Yeah, we can hear the division bell. Don't worry about it. There isn't anything you can do about it anyway. But just for our viewers, viewers that you're not being rung for tea or something, it is the division bell.
And it's not being rung for a vote on this issue, because there is significant Tory disquiet actually about the reductions to troop numbers. There's no question about that. But it also, from a political point of view, and of course the more important thing here is the decisions and the actual concrete outcomes of this defence review. But from a political point of view, it's very interesting and very obvious to see that Keir Starmer is trying here to, you know, metaphorically put Labour tanks on Tories' lawns to stand up for the defence interests of the country, which, while John Healey says, yes, it's been Labour policy forever, for example, on the nuclear deterrent, it has been Labour's established policy, but it's certainly been contested. And traditionally, as our viewers will all know, it's the Conservatives who are normally seen as strong on defence, and Labour that's, you know, not always been quite as reliable as many people would see it in that regard. And it's fascinating right now when Keir Starmer is, we know, number one on his list is showing that things have changed under his leadership. He chose today to use many of his questions on defence to try to put him in that kind of light.
Well, as you say, it is very interesting. Something else that came up in the exchanges, in fact, this was between the Prime Minister, who was then rebuked by the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, because Boris Johnson suggested that there were Labour politicians out on the protest that you will have seen the pictures of. We covered the story on Monday on the streets of Bristol against the police and crime bill. The Speaker said to Boris Johnson that that statement was surely not correct, as he went on to say, we're all united in the protection in this House, in the support and the protection that the police offer us. No one would shy away from that. Now, I put the question about condemning the violence that we saw. We showed the pictures of police vans on fire on Sunday evening during those protests in Bristol. I put that question to the Labour MP, Nadia Whittome, and this is how she responded to me. Do you want to condemn the violent scenes that we have just shown all our viewers from last night?
Of course, Jo, I don't want to see violence against anybody.
So you condemn it?
And I wish everybody who's been hurt in this a speedy recovery. I'm not going to, as I've already said, I'm not going to get into the business of condemning protesters until we know exactly what's happened.
So, John, you wouldn't condemn the protesters until there's been an inquiry. What do you make of that?
I will. It was utterly inexcusable. I'm pleased that the police are following up the operations from the night now by arresting those involved. And for me, it was utterly counterproductive. If really their mission was to try and protect the right for peaceful protest, which is a legitimate debate and a legitimate concern that we've got with these extreme steps the government needs to take with COVID restrictions, then they undermine their very case. Right. But Nadia Whittome is a colleague of yours. She is a Labour MP. She sits in the House of Commons. You've been very clear. Should any action be taken on that basis against her? She is a Labour MP. She's a Labour voice as part of the Labour Party, but I'm in the shadow cabinet, and the Labour front bench, and Keir Starmer in particular, has been very clear about Labour's condemnation of that violence. Right. I mean, Laura, it certainly was something that the other guests on the show agreed with John Healey about. She is a Labour MP. She doesn't sit in the front bench, but people may wonder whether Keir Starmer should have words with Nadia Whittome.
Well, it's a tricky thing because there is a lot of political opposition to the substance of what is in the bill, the legislation that's actually going through. But I think clearly what Labour is trying to do at the top of the party is do two things. Is one, express concerns about the function of the bill, but also be condemning of these kinds of scenes that we have seen. But there are, in pockets of the Labour Party, no question, some voices like Nadia Whittome who look at it in a different way. And it's tricky for the leadership to be, you know, riding those horses at the same time. Let's move on to asylum. Chris, we're going to move on to the issue that, in fact, is part of your brief, which is about asylum seekers. We are and have actually been watching Priti Patel, who is up in the Commons at the moment, talking about it. I think we can hear a bit of what she said. Oh, no, we're going to hear her in just a moment. Chris, we talked about it earlier in the programme. The key proposal is that if someone arrives in the UK, how they got here should be taken into account in assessing their asylum claims. Why?
Well, because our system is fundamentally broken. The asylum system has become overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Too many people are entering the country illegally. 16,000 last year that we know about because of various pull factors and other things. These journeys are dangerous because crossing the English Channel in a rubber dinghy is an inherently dangerous thing to do. A young family died towards the end of last year attempting to do so. Those journeys are illegal, but they're also unnecessary because France, for example, is a perfectly safe country with a very well-functioning asylum system. So we're determined to overhaul the system, to fix this broken system so it works properly. So we can firstly offer protection to those people who are genuinely in need, for instance, by continuing with our resettlement programme, where genuine refugees, including families and women and children from dangerous conflict zones, are brought to the UK directly. And in fact, our resettlement scheme over the last 5 or 6 years has been the largest of any country in Europe. So we stand by our humanitarian obligations, as we have done in the past.
All right.
But if somebody comes here, as you were asking, illegally, for example, on a small boat, from a country where they could have claimed asylum, like France, then we will treat them differently. We will firstly say that their asylum claim is inadmissible for 6 months while we seek to remove them either back to the country of embarkation or to some other safe third country where they can be accommodated, right? And that's to act as a deterrent to stop people making these dangerous and unnecessary journeys from places like France.
Right, but but hang on, Chris. Suppose that person, I mean, it is likely that they are fleeing some sort of persecution or fleeing a war, but perhaps they're fleeing because of their political views or their sexual orientation, and they could even potentially face death in their home country. And you're going to send them back, are you, to face whatever consequences they might, because they came here, in your view, illegally?
No, certainly not, because that would be in contravention of ECHR Article 3, and these proposals are fully ECHR compliant. We would, to be clear, because I think there's a misunderstanding, we would either, if we could, return them to the country of embarkation, such as France, which is manifestly safe, or seek to return them with the agreement of the third country to some other safe country, not their country of origin. Okay? If after 6 months we couldn't do that, we would then consider their asylum claim substantively here in the UK, but they'd get a temporary form of leave, recognising the fact that they'd come here illegally and unnecessarily. But under no circumstances would we return someone to their country of origin if it might be dangerous to do so, because that would be contrary to the ECHR and all kinds of other things as well.
I mean, John, do you accept that something has to be done about the system as it currently stands? That actually seeing those pictures, I think yesterday it was a record number of people trying to cross the Channel in this dinghy for this year, 183. And it usually involves some sort of people smugglers, and many people die on those routes over. That has to stop, and anything that does deter people making that journey is worth considering.
Anything that deters people trying to make that journey, anything that stops the people behind it smuggling them and making vast profits needs to be looked at. But the system isn't working, that's clear. If the system's broken, as the immigration minister says, that's after 11 years of his own government. And in fact, although the number of people trying to cross the Channel may be edging up, actually the number of people seeking asylum and refugee status in Britain has been going down in recent years. What has been rising, however, is the backlog in cases, as Chris Philp's own department is failing to get to grips with those. And the number of people whose claims have failed and have been forced out of the country as a result of that, that's reached an all-time low. So the system may be broken, but it needs to be fixed from within. And I think some of this in these proposals is simply a distraction from the task that the ministers before Chris Philp and now with him have just failed to get a grip of.
Laura?
Do you have, Minister, any concrete assurances from any other country that they will actually help you make this work? I mean, you said, oh, we will return them to another country, but with the EU, us being out of the EU and not part of the arrangements of the European Union yet, do you have any concrete assurances from other countries that could make this work?
Well, we're in discussions at the moment, as you can imagine. We only left the Dublin system a matter of a few weeks ago. Those discussions are ongoing, and I'm obviously not going to provide a running commentary on them.
But if the Home Secretary is announcing a major reform today, and you're telling our viewers that you don't actually have the concrete plans in place for this to happen, how can people have any faith in the suggestion that this will actually be workable?
Well, look, we're laying out our proposals today. We'll be legislating in due course, and in parallel with that, we're having the discussions that you would expect us to be having.
But are you sure that other countries will go for it?
Well, but these proposals will have a significant effect, regardless of third country agreements. Much of these proposals are simply changes to make in our domestic system. One of the reasons we have so many people waiting to be processed and indeed waiting for removal is because our legal system isn't working as it should. Let me give you an example. You may have someone with an asylum claim that gets considered and rejected, but they can make further claims, often over a period of years, almost without limitation, that prevents removal. And that applies to dangerous foreign criminals, sort of murderers and rapists, as much as to other people as well. And so we intend to reform the way the legal system works to get everyone to bring their claims in one go, on one occasion, so it can be properly considered with an appeal. But we don't want to have these repeated claims strung out over years. So the reason that we have a problem to fix is partly that we were in the common European asylum system. We only left that a few weeks ago. And secondly, our legal system, because the way it's developed, has caused these structural problems that these proposals will fix. And I think the public will welcome that. We're looking to protect our borders from illegal immigration, remove people who shouldn't be here, but protect people who are genuinely in need. Those are our critical objectives.
Well, would you welcome that, John?
Well, we've said, our Shadow Home Secretary said we'll look very closely at what they're proposing. But to be quite honest, these are problems in the system that should have been fixed over the last 10 years. We need a fairer immigration system. For me, that means a closer contact kept with those who are here applying, faster decisions, better support for those who are waiting a decision, and then stronger action to remove from the country those whose applications have failed. And on all four fronts, this government's going backwards. And I fear the proposals that we're hearing today, pretty half-baked, are not going to deal with those real problems.
We've only got a few seconds left, Chris.
Well, look, we only left the common European asylum system a matter of a few weeks ago, and we have had consistent opposition from the Labour Party when we've tried to deport dangerous foreign criminals, for example, in December. So it's time the Labour Party started supporting us on border control, something they have failed to do over the last few years. All right, we're going to have to leave it there. I said we would bring you a bit of Priti Patel. We've run out of time, I'm afraid, but she is still in the House of Commons outlining those plans. From all of us here, thank you very much. I'll be back tomorrow.